Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more love stories like this one. Romantic, dramatic, and impossible to forget. Now let's begin. Madeline Price was the kind of woman no one noticed when she walked into a room, and that's exactly how she liked it. With her hair always tied in a low bun, glasses perched on her nose, and her simple pencil skirts, she blended into the background of the towering corporate building. As a junior assistant at Blackstone Enterprises, she was known for being quiet, competent, and never asking for more than she was given. She typed reports, organized files, and kept her head down, even when others took credit for her work. But beneath her modest appearance lived a sharp mind, a secret past, and a heart that longed for something deeper than spreadsheets and silent coffees. Every morning, she rode the elevator to the 56th floor and tried not to glance at the office in the corner, the one that belonged to him. Nicholas Blackstone, billionaire CEO, ruthless negotiator, and the man who unknowingly haunted her dreams. He never noticed her, of course. He barely noticed anyone who wasn't wearing a power suit or closing million-dollar deals. Still, she watched him from afar. The way he clenched his jaw when he was annoyed, the way he ran his fingers through his hair when frustrated, and the rare, fleeting smile that made her chest ache. She told herself it meant nothing, but it did. Nicholas Blackstone lived in a world of precision, control, and iron boundaries. At 38, he had built an empire from the ashes of a broken childhood and refused to let anyone close enough to shake his foundation. His rules were simple: no distractions, no complications, and absolutely no involvement with employees. So when Madeline entered his office one Monday morning with a file in hand and a spark in her voice, he barely looked up. "Leave it on the desk," he muttered, not knowing that moment would shatter every rule he'd ever made. But her voice, soft, clear, and laced with something he couldn't name, made him glance up. Their eyes met for the first time, and something flickered in the space between them. He dismissed it quickly, burying it beneath layers of logic and distance. But that night, for the first time in years, he remembered someone's voice instead of his own thoughts. And that terrified him more than he could admit. Over the next few weeks, something unspoken began to grow between them. Madeline never flirted, never lingered, never crossed the line, but her presence became impossible to ignore. Nicholas found himself watching her in meetings, noting how she scribbled notes furiously and bit her lip when focused. He started asking for her specifically, under the guise of needing organization, efficiency, discretion. She remained polite, professional, and frustratingly unreadable. He began staying late just to see if she was still in the office, finding excuses to pass by her desk. When she brought him coffee, he noticed she remembered how he took it. Black, no sugar. He told himself it meant nothing, but it did. And the worst part? She never acted impressed by his power or wealth, which only made her more dangerous. Because she wasn't chasing him, and that made him want to chase her. The tension came to a head during a corporate retreat at a luxury resort outside the city. Madeline had been chosen to assist the executive team, a decision that raised eyebrows but couldn't be questioned. Nicholas had approved it. She stayed professional, even when Nicholas watched her across dinner tables, across bonfires, across crowded conference rooms. On the second night, a storm rolled in, grounding flights and canceling plans. The power flickered, and half the staff retreated to their rooms, leaving only a few behind. Madeline had gone to retrieve a forgotten laptop when she ran into Nicholas in the hallway. The lights dimmed, thunder cracked, and for a moment, they stood still, just the two of them. Neither spoke, but the silence between them felt heavier than words. And in a moment of weakness, or maybe clarity, he leaned in and kissed her. And she kissed him back, like she'd been waiting her whole life to do it. The kiss was electric, uncontrolled, undeniable, and over far too quickly. As soon as Nicholas pulled back, guilt and panic clouded his eyes. He muttered something about a mistake, about lines being crossed, and walked away without another word. Madeline stood in the hallway, breathless, confused, and already mourning something that hadn't begun. The next morning, she was summoned to HR and told her position had been terminated due to departmental restructuring. She knew better. It was him. He had kissed her, and now he was erasing her. But before she left, she requested a final meeting with Nicholas. They stood in his office, the distance between them cold and wide. And before turning to leave, she whispered 7 words that made his blood run cold. You only fire what you're afraid of. Nicholas sat in silence after she left, her words echoing like a storm through his chest. You only fire what you're afraid of. He laughed bitterly, but the truth in her voice pierced deeper than any accusation. He wasn't afraid of her. He was afraid of how she made him feel. Afraid of wanting something real in a world where nothing stayed. Afraid of losing control over his carefully guarded life. Afraid of being seen and loved anyway. But now she was gone, and all that remained was the bitter taste of regret. For days, he tried to drown the memory of her kiss in meetings, contracts, and late-night scotch. But her whisper haunted him more than her absence ever could. Madeline returned to her quiet apartment with no job and no plan. She packed away her office heels and corporate ID, vowing to never let a man cost her peace again. But as the days passed, she didn't cry. She painted. Canvas after canvas, her emotions bled in color. Anger in red, sorrow in blue, hope in gold. She hadn't touched a brush in years, not since college when art had been her first love. And through her pain, she found her purpose again, not in boardrooms, but in bold strokes. She started selling her pieces online, gaining traction from strangers who saw their own heartbreak in her work. One night, she posted a painting titled Fear of Her, a faceless man kneeling before a woman made of fire. It went viral within hours, shared by influencers and art critics alike. And one of those shares landed directly in Nicholas Blackstone's inbox. He stared at the painting, heart pounding, instantly knowing it was hers. She hadn't signed it, but the title said enough. Fear of Her. It wasn't just art, it was a message, and it shattered his last defense. He realized then that she hadn't just walked away, she had risen. And while he tried to bury their connection, she had turned it into something powerful. Nicholas canceled all his meetings, closed his laptop, and stood by the window with shaking hands. He had built towers of steel and glass, but this woman had built something far stronger, truth. He couldn't lose her, not when he hadn't even tried to win her. For the first time in his life, the billionaire dropped everything for something money couldn't buy. And he knew exactly what he had to do. Madeline received the invitation on a rainy afternoon, a private showing at an upscale gallery, featuring her. Confused and suspicious, she almost ignored it, until she saw the address. It was his. Nicholas had converted an entire floor of his building into an art exhibit, dedicated solely to her work. When she arrived, she found soft lights, white walls, and dozens of her paintings displayed with care. Each piece had a plaque with words she'd never written, but he had. His interpretations, his reflections, his regrets, one by one. They told a story of a man who had finally learned how to feel. At the center of the room was a final painting, an empty canvas with a question in gold. Can we start again? She turned slowly, and there he was, standing beside a single rose. No suit, no arrogance, just a man who had fallen in love too late. Madeline, he whispered, I'm not afraid anymore. She didn't speak, not yet. She walked past the rose, past the paintings, letting silence speak for her. Nicholas followed, not begging, not rushing, just waiting, finally willing to listen. When she stopped at the window overlooking the city, she turned to face him fully. I don't want apologies, she said. I want honesty. He nodded, voice breaking. I fired you because I felt something I couldn't control, and that scared me more than failure ever could. She stepped closer, heart pounding. And now, he smiled faintly. Now I'm terrified of never holding you again. For a moment, she said nothing, her eyes locked on his. And then she whispered, then don't waste another second. Madeline didn't fall into his arms that night, and Nicholas didn't expect her to. She left the gallery quietly, but not before brushing her fingertips across his hand. A promise, not a surrender. For the next few days, they exchanged short, careful messages, each word weighed with hope and hesitation. Nicholas began showing up at her art studio, never uninvited, always respectful, just present. He watched her paint in silence, often bringing coffee or fresh flowers without expecting anything in return. Madeline kept her guard up, still unsure if he was a changed man or just desperate to reclaim what he'd lost. But slowly, the walls between them began to crumble, replaced by trust forged not in words but in action. He supported her without overshadowing her, championing her independence instead of trying to control it. She let him into her life one moment at a time, never all at once, but piece by piece. And with each new piece, Nicholas discovered that loving her meant becoming someone new himself. Their connection deepened during late-night talks in her small studio, surrounded by the smell of paint and old books. Madeline spoke of her childhood, of growing up poor and invisible, of teaching herself to dream in silence. Nicholas, in return, opened up about his emotionally distant father and the pressure of perfection that shaped his empire. For the first time, neither of them wore masks. Vulnerability was no longer a weakness, but a language of love. They laughed about their awkward beginnings, the kiss, the firing, the haunting whisper that started it all. But some shadows still lingered, especially the fear that what they were building might not survive the outside world. Nicholas suggested taking a weekend away, just the two of them, no distractions. They escaped to a quiet lake house, far from boardrooms and press, where the air smelled like pine and possibility. It was there, under the stars and by the fire, that Madeline finally said it out loud. "I think I'm falling in love with you." And Nicholas, for the first time in his life, replied without hesitation, "I already have." Returning to the city meant returning to reality, one that included rumors, headlines, and scrutiny. The tabloids had already begun spinning stories about the CEO and the fired assistant turned artist. Nicholas tried to shield her from the media storm, but Madeline refused to hide again. She stood tall at his side during a charity gala, wearing a simple emerald dress and more courage than she'd ever known. People stared, whispered, and speculated, but she didn't flinch, and neither did he. When a journalist asked if their relationship violated any company policy, Nicholas answered calmly, "I violated my own fear. That's all." Madeline squeezed his hand, her smile small but fierce, and the crowd fell strangely silent. The headlines the next day read, "Billionaire CEO stuns with poetic confession." For once, the media didn't twist their story, it amplified their truth. And in that truth, they found strength. But not everyone was ready to support their happiness. Margot Sinclair, the cold and calculating COO of Blackstone Enterprises, saw Madeline as a threat. She had been loyal to Nicholas for over a decade, harboring quiet ambitions of becoming more than his business partner. When she saw Madeline walking the halls of the company again, this time as a guest, something in her snapped. She scheduled an emergency board meeting and painted Madeline as a liability, accusing Nicholas of favoritism. Nicholas defended her, but Margot had planted a seed of doubt among shareholders. Madeline, overhearing whispers in the hallway, decided to walk away again. This time for him, not because of him. She left a note in his office. "I believe in you, but I won't cost you your legacy." When Nicholas read it, he didn't hesitate. He stormed into the boardroom and made a choice. "I'd rather lose this company than lose her," he declared, and meant every word. The boardroom fell silent as his words echoed through the room like a bomb. Some were shocked, others impressed, but none could question his conviction. He reminded them that Blackstone Enterprises was built on innovation and heart, not fear and control. "If this company falls apart because I chose love," he said, "then it was never worth saving." Madeline watched the press conference from her apartment, tears in her eyes and hope blooming in her chest. The next morning, Nicholas showed up at her door, not as a CEO, not as a billionaire, but as a man in love. He dropped to his knees, not in apology, but in reverence. "I don't care what we lose, as long as I have you," he whispered. Madeline pulled him to his feet and kissed him like the answer was always yes. Because it always had been. Nicholas's bold move sparked waves across the corporate world and social media alike. Articles praised him, criticized him, and turned their love story into a viral moment. Offers came pouring in for interviews, book deals, and talk shows, but Madeline declined them all. "This is real to me," she told Nicholas. "It's not a brand." Instead, she focused on her art, now more popular than ever, while Nicholas began restructuring his company with new values. He made space for emotion in a world that had taught him to be cold, and hired Madeline as a consultant, not out of romance, but respect. They worked side by side like equals, each learning from the other's strengths and scars. Their love wasn't perfect. It had sharp edges, deep wounds, and a history of fear. But it was theirs, and it was worth fighting for every single day. Because love, they realized, was not weakness, it was courage. Autumn arrived with golden leaves and quiet mornings, a peace neither of them had ever known. They started spending weekends in her apartment instead of his penthouse, cherishing the simple things. Madeline cooked while Nicholas read poetry aloud, often blushing at the romantic verses. They took long walks in the park, no bodyguards, no headlines, just two people who had found home in each other. One evening, as she painted a mural on their shared bedroom wall, he wrapped his arms around her from behind. "I never believed in forever before you," he murmured. Madeline paused, resting her hand over his. "And now?" He kissed her shoulder and whispered, "Now, I'm afraid one lifetime won't be enough." She turned to him, tears sparkling. "Then let's start today like it's our last." And in that moment, everything else faded. But the peace was soon disrupted by a phone call Madeline never expected. Her estranged mother, whom she hadn't spoken to in 10 years, had been hospitalized. Memories of abandonment, of cold nights and empty promises came rushing back. Nicholas offered to go with her, but she insisted on facing it alone. At the hospital, she found a frail woman who barely resembled the mother she remembered. They talked, awkwardly at first, then with surprising honesty. Madeline didn't offer forgiveness, but she offered something better, closure. And with that, she returned home lighter, no longer haunted by a past she had outgrown. Nicholas held her that night without asking questions, letting silence do the healing. Because some wounds didn't need fixing, they just needed to be seen. After months of rebuilding and rediscovery, Nicholas took Madeline on a surprise trip to Florence. They wandered through cobblestone streets, visited art museums, and made love beneath ancient ceilings. One evening, he brought her to a quiet vineyard at sunset, the sky blushing with orange and lavender. He dropped to one knee again, this time not out of fear, but out of love. "I fired you because I was afraid of what you meant to me," he said. "But I'll spend the rest of my life hiring your heart, again and again, if you'll let me." Madeline laughed through tears, taking his face in her hands. "You don't have to ask," she whispered. "I've already said yes with every kiss." They kissed beneath the fading sun, surrounded by vines and vows. And the future, for once, didn't feel so far away. They returned home engaged, hearts full and souls settled. But life had one more twist to offer, one Madeline discovered in the form of a tiny white stick. She stared at the pregnancy test in shock, fear, and quiet joy. Nicholas found her in the bathroom, trembling and speechless, and knelt beside her once more. "I don't know if I'm ready," she confessed. He took her hand, eyes wet. "Neither am I, but I want to be. With you." They sat on the floor, laughing and crying, already falling in love with someone they hadn't met. Together, they had been broken, fired, lost, and reborn. And now, they were going to become something else entirely. A family. The news of the baby shifted everything for Nicholas and Madeline. Plans, priorities, even how they moved through each day. He read every parenting book he could find, while she researched soft lullabies and painted stars on the nursery wall. They took long walks talking about names, values, and how to raise a child in a world that once tried to crush them both. Nicholas started coming home earlier, leaving meetings with unfinished agendas just to hold Madeline's hand at the doctor's appointments. Madeline, always so independent, found comfort in leaning on him for once, and he cherished being leaned on. They took a sabbatical from their respective work, realizing time was the most precious currency they had. During quiet mornings, Nicholas would talk to her growing belly, telling silly stories and promising a life full of wonder. Their love grew deeper not just from passion but from purpose, the kind of bond formed only when two people build something together. Each day, they became less about past pain and more about future hope. And though fear crept in occasionally, it never stayed long, because now they had each other to fight it off. At 7 months pregnant, Madeline was glowing, radiant in a way Nicholas had never seen before. They hosted a small baby shower in the garden of their countryside retreat, surrounded by only those who truly mattered. No photographers, no press, just friends, laughter, and warmth. She wore a pale lavender dress, and he couldn't stop looking at her as if she were the only light in the world. Margot Sinclair, once Nicholas's coldest ally, sent a quiet letter of apology, acknowledging that love had changed him for the better. Madeline forgave her from a distance, not because she forgot, but because she had chosen peace. That night, as candles flickered under the stars, Nicholas gave her a handwritten letter. In it, he thanked her not just for the baby, but for awakening a man he never knew he could be. She cried as she read it, then folded it close to her chest like it was made of gold. "I was saving myself for a love that would fight for me," she whispered. "And you did." But one evening, without warning, Madeline began feeling sharp pains and breathless nausea. Nicholas rushed her to the hospital, his calm replaced with pure panic, holding her hand as machines beeped and nurses moved quickly. She was going into labor, early. The doctors prepared them for complications, and Nicholas's world narrowed to the sound of her heartbeat and the sight of her strength. Madeline never cried, never broke. She whispered, "I'm okay," even when she clearly wasn't, just to calm him. Hours later, their daughter came into the world, tiny, fragile, but breathing. They named her Lila Hope Blackstone, because hope had been the thread that stitched their lives together. Nicholas held his newborn daughter like she was the universe, shaking with a joy he had never known. Madeline, exhausted, reached for both of them and smiled through tears. "We made it," she said, and for the first time, Nicholas believed it. The weeks that followed were filled with midnight feedings, lullabies, and quiet awe. Nicholas changed diapers and designer suits, humming lullabies off-key just to make Lila giggle. Madeline painted again, one-handed while holding her daughter, capturing motherhood in brushstrokes. They took turns sleeping, laughing over who looked more exhausted, more in love. Lila's presence brought out the softest sides of Nicholas, ones he had hidden even from himself. He cried during storybooks, kissed her forehead 100 times a day, and whispered promises into her tiny ears. Madeline watched them and knew. She had never made a better decision than trusting this man with her heart. And even in the chaos of parenthood, their romance never dulled, it matured. Love, they realized, wasn't a moment. It was a million small choices, made every single day. And they chose each other, always. Nicholas surprised her one Sunday morning with a quiet wedding on the cliffside of their lake house. There were only a handful of guests, and Lila served as the world's tiniest flower girl. Madeline wore a simple white gown, barefoot, carrying a bouquet of wildflowers Nicholas picked himself. The officiant spoke briefly, but their vows told the real story. "I once fired you because I was afraid of you," Nicholas said, voice trembling. "But now I wake up every day praying I never lose you again." Madeline laughed, tearful. "You once tried to control me, but then you learned to love me freely. And that's when I knew we had forever." They kissed as the wind lifted her veil, and Lila cooed in the background as if blessing the union. The sunset bathed them in gold, and for once, there were no regrets, only gratitude. They had walked through fire and come out shining. And now, they were husband and wife. Their marriage didn't come with fireworks every day, but it came with something better, peace. Mornings were spent in quiet routines, from breakfast to playtime with Lila in the garden. They bought a small vineyard nearby, turning it into a creative retreat for artists and dreamers. Madeline taught workshops in painting and healing, and Nicholas funded scholarships for struggling creatives. Their home became a haven, not of wealth, but of welcome. The staff adored Madeline, who insisted on cooking Sunday dinners and painting personal thank you cards. Nicholas still ran Blackstone Enterprises, but with a renewed heart and radically fair policies. They created a foundation in Lila's name, focused on supporting single mothers and women in transition. Everything they had, they shared, and everything they were, they grew together. Because love wasn't about having it all. It was about giving it away. Years passed, but their passion never dimmed. They celebrated every anniversary by revisiting the places that marked their journey. The gallery, the bookstore, the rooftop where he first kissed her. Each time, they brought Lila, teaching her that love wasn't perfect, it was persistent. She grew up knowing her mother was once fired and her father once afraid, but both chose courage in the end. Nicholas wrote a memoir titled The Whisper That Changed Everything, dedicated to Madeline. It became a bestseller not because of fame, but because it was honest. Madeline illustrated it, filling it with quiet watercolor moments from their life. They hosted a reading at the bookstore where she used to work, and she signed books alongside him. Their past wasn't a scar, it was a signature, and they were proud of every line. When Lila turned 5, She asked her mother, "What did you whisper that day he fired you?" Madeline smiled and replied, "I told him he was running away from the only thing that could save him." Lila blinked. And did it save him? Nicholas walked in, kissed Madeline's forehead, and answered, "Every single day." That night, they sat around the fire, telling stories, not just of pain, but of resilience. Their daughter fell asleep in Nicholas's arms, and Madeline leaned into his shoulder, content. They had built a life not out of luck, but of brave choices. And the most important choice had been forgiveness. It had turned bitterness into beauty, and a single whisper into forever. They never stopped dating each other, even after years of marriage. Nicholas still left notes in her pockets, and Madeline still surprised him with midnight picnics on the rooftop. Love wasn't just sustained. It was celebrated, nurtured, protected. And even in hardship, when they faced health scares, business setbacks, or parenting struggles, they leaned into each other. Because pain wasn't their enemy anymore. It was just part of the symphony. They learned that sometimes love whispers, sometimes it roars, but it never lies. Their home remained filled with laughter, art, and poetry, the things that built them. And in their daughter's eyes, they saw not just the future, but the proof of everything they had overcome. They didn't just live happily ever after. They lived gratefully. Every kiss, every whisper, every morning. In their old age, sitting on that same lakeside porch where they once fell in love, Nicholas turned to Madeline. "Do you ever think about how it started?" he asked, voice weathered but warm. She chuckled. "I think about that kiss you fired me for at least once a week." He laughed, then took her hand. "And what you whispered?" She squeezed his fingers. "I meant it then. I mean it now." He looked out at the water, then back at her. "You didn't just save me, Madeline. You made me." Their daughter, now grown, arrived with her own little girl, another beginning. Nicholas bent down to kiss his granddaughter's cheek and whispered, "Love always finds a way." The sun set on them, golden and gentle, just like the lives they had built. And in that final moment, all was quiet, except for the echo of a whisper that had changed everything.